I'm Alan Schaefer, a community development major here. I believe a couple of you touched on this already, but do you believe that the current voting registration system in Minnesota has room for improvement? And if so, how would you propose improving the system? Lee.
And so, Mr. Severson, you can answer that question first.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's room for improvement. What I think our election system should move to, vote early, vote anywhere. I believe that, Steve Simon is right in early voting, although I believe that 2 weeks should be the cutoff. What happens in early voting, if you're voting too early, it's kind of like the last 2 minutes in the basketball game. That's all you have to watch to really know what's going on, right? But if you vote, at the halftime, all of a sudden the game changes and your vote's already in. So that's the pitfall with early voting. So I think a cutoff of about 2 weeks prior to the election would be appropriate. Along the same line, as I delineated before, same-day registration is a huge vulnerability. We are one of the few states, maybe 2 or 3 states, that you can actually vouch for someone. And I've got testimony in here about incidents that have taken place in the metro area here where Students Organizing for America have gotten together and they have organized a vouching pool to go over and vouch for one another. And the election judge got pretty upset about that. Rightfully so, rightfully so. And so what happens in that process is they go in, they vouch for the individual, and that there's no validation that that individual is eligible. In fact, 20 or 30 students up in Duluth got processed for voting because they were from Wisconsin. So what are these vulnerabilities? Same-day registration is a huge vulnerability, and the no excuse absentee voting has accentuated that vulnerability. It's a problem. And so I think we'll see that after this election as we do the audit on the system and find out exactly how many were actually eligible to do that. But the bottom line on it is we can fix that because the technology today exists where you can go in, you can swipe your ID card, you can swipe your driver's license or some form of ID, and you can get that validation on the spot. And again, if you can't get it for some obscure reason, you can do a provisional ballot, which most of the states do that have those kind of requirements. And that provisional ballot is held. You can go back home, get the validation, bring it down, and validate it, and then that ballot will be counted. But until we do that kind of correction in our system, we will have orchestrated vulnerabilities that can actually change the course of not just seats, not just a single election, but a number of elections. And when you talk about the legislature is decided sometimes by 2 and 3 seats. And when the legislature swaps over, you have a whole different ideology that's coming up from the speaker, the whole 9 yards. So it has huge implications. The guarantee to the Minnesota voter should be that when you go to that poll to cast your vote, that you know that you've done your homework and that that vote counts 1 vote. If someone else is voting who isn't eligible, someone from Wisconsin comes in, or someone's voting 2 or 3 times because they're riding a bus around the state, your vote is no longer 1 vote. It becomes a fraction of a vote. And that is not fair. That is not the way our founders envisioned this. And so one of the other things I wanted to talk a little bit about the express lane voting, since I have 1 minute left, is the military, as Representative Simon had alluded to. The military have a military ID card. That doesn't mean they don't have a driver's license. They can use a driver's license that they're here in the state. If they're overseas, they can use that military vote. And my idea is to use a cipher network that all of the military have in terms of encryption and allow them to vote overseas, which they're not being able to do now, at their convenience, at the computer, print out a hard copy, and then send that over so that our warfighters actually get to cast a vote instead of sitting back there at 5%. 5%, folks. That is unconscionable. So thank you for the good, it's a great question, and we can clean up our act.
Thank you, Mr. Severson. Mr. Helen, would you like to respond?
Thank you for the question, Alan. How would I improve the voter registration system? Again, this really wades into the legislative area of how we do that. And we've had a lot of changes over the year, so there aren't specific priorities that I do have for that. I would touch on a couple things, again, in terms of the modernization. I moved this year, so I registered online. That was something that was new that the Secretary of State had piloted, and then there were some legal issues, and then there was some quick action in the legislature. So that all worked out for the best. You know, in terms of the simple enhancements that we can make to that type of system, I wasn't able to sign up for any type of listserv that I'm aware of to sign up. You know, most sites that you fill out a form on, they want you to check the box on the bottom to get the notifications. That's something that really simply, you know, the same thing the Secretary of State does with annual renewals for business filings. You know, why not do something as simple as that to make sure we're reminding people of what they did back on some day in June after they moved. So, you know, it's about informing people of what their rights are and what the processes are and the tools for finding information out about those processes, the candidates. One thing that I just want to be really clear on in terms of my support, my understanding of the election system, voting in this office, is that for me, voting is a choice. It's not an act. We have the sense of voting as pulling a lever, checking a box or something, but the real vote happens before you ever get to the ballot box, or even before you ever register. You have something in your mind that says, I want to support this initiative, this person. Some people want to support a party. Obviously, we all make our choices independently, and I agree with the actions the legislature has taken and what the Secretary of State had done to make that choice easy without any physical burdens or any time-based constraints. So I love the discussion of early voting. It's something I would certainly throw my support behind, but it's a legislative issue. I'm not going to make a promise that I can get you early voting at any time. So my philosophy will be to support the idea that voting is a choice, not an act, but there are vulnerabilities. We can't ignore the types of things that Dan has mentioned, but to use Steve's saying, you know, if the cure is worse than the disease, that's also going to lead to fractional votings or misrepresentation in the electorate if one person's turned away. So we've got to be cognizant of both sides of the issue, voting registration. I just want to make people as informed as possible in serving the role of Secretary of State, but I can't promise any specific legislation that will come as a result of that. So I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Helen. Mr. Simon?
Well, thanks for the question. I think our voter registration system in Minnesota is one of the reasons why our election system is the envy of the nation. You know, one of the things that I've had the privilege to do in the legislature and as chair of the elections committee is talk to people from other states. And people from other states often say things like, boy, I wish we had something like you have, or I wish we had the access rules and laws that you have. And one of the things they almost always mention is same-day voter registration. Minnesota's had that since the early 1970s. We were one of the very first states to do it. Others have followed suit, and there are other states or people in those states that want to do it. So it's been a great thing, a great gateway to democracy in Minnesota, and a great way, again, to open those doors of participation for all eligible voters and not slam doors in people's faces. And I think preserving and protecting and defending same-day voter registration is key, and I would use the power of the office, or at least the so-called bully pulpit, to fight against attempts that would unduly and unnecessarily weaken it. Part of the process that we have in same-day voter registration in Minnesota is we have something that's been alluded to before as vouching. So what happens if you move in October? What happens if you move from one place in Minnesota to another in October and you don't have an ID that shows your current address? And that's what you need, an ID that shows your current address. What if you don't even have a utility bill yet? What if you moved in from out of state? Either you were a student who transferred here, or your family moved here, or for work you moved here. What do you do then? Well, we have a system called vouching, where someone who lives in your precinct swears under penalty of perjury, which is a felony, and that person would face a serious prison time if they lied, can vouch for the identity. And another story about my dad. So my father, who I told you about at the beginning, in the 1990s, my parents downsized and moved from Hopkins to a place in Minneapolis. And they did so in October. And my dad could not have voted in that election. Could not have voted had not someone, his neighbor, his new neighbor, vouched for him, because he didn't have a utility bill and he certainly didn't have an ID. So those kind of practicalities matter. They certainly mattered in my family as well. I alluded a little bit ago in response to another question to some of the things I do in terms of voter registration. One is to tweak and improve and modernize and make more future-oriented our current motor voter law. And I'm intrigued by those who say that it's possible to do a so-called opt-out rather than an opt-in. In other words, unless you checked that box on your driver's license renewal, you would be registered to vote if, of course, you pass through all the screens and filters and checks. I'm intrigued by that as well, so I think that's one way that we can modernize and improve our voter registration system. And then there's another one too. I really appreciate Mr. Helen has talked frequently about the importance of data. And I think he's right. He's absolutely right. And one of the things that we've done in Minnesota recently, just in the last few months, is Minnesota joined a group, a collection, a consortium, I guess, of other states. I think it's up to 12 or 14 states right now that share data, all encrypted, all super secret and secure, but share data about various people who are registered or not, people who have a felony conviction or not, and it will have the effect over the long run of making sure that we identify people who are registered and shouldn't be, whether those are people convicted of a felony, but also identify those who aren't registered to vote, who perhaps could be. It's always their choice, but who perhaps could be. And I think that's important, and that is a nonpartisan thing. It's the Pew Center is behind that, and they're a well-respected, nationally renowned group that is very much nonpartisan, and they're the ones behind that. Minnesota happily has joined that coalition, and I think that too will go a long way towards streamlining and making more fair and more accurate our voter registration rules. I think that's a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Simon.